Don't forget to like and subscribe. I've never been one to believe in ghosts. Neither has my family. We're the biggest skeptics you'll ever meet, which is why I still struggle to explain what happened that night. It all started when I was talking to my cousin, Daniel, in the kitchen of our house in Oak Ridge, a quiet little town in Colorado. I grabbed a bottle of water and casually asked if he believed in the supernatural. He shook his head, but hesitated before telling me something strange, something he couldn't explain. That's when I asked, "Did you ever try to scare me when I was younger?" I planned to follow up with my own story, but before I could, Daniel's response made my stomach twist. "All I did was throw a toy at you while you were on the computer," he said with a laugh. I wish he hadn't said that, because what happened to me back in 8th grade was much worse than a toy being thrown. It was winter, and I had just gotten home from school. The house was empty. My parents were working late, and Daniel had plans with friends. After dropping my bag by the door, I headed upstairs to my room, plugged in my earbuds, and started watching YouTube. I wasn't the kind of kid who made a lot of noise when I was alone. Something about an empty house always made me uneasy. Like if I stayed quiet enough, I might hear something I wasn't supposed to. That day, I did. Halfway through video, I paused it to go to the bathroom. The layout of our house was weird. If you stepped out of the bathroom and turned left, you'd be in Daniel's room. If you turned right, you'd head down the staircase to the front entrance. The house also had an old security system that would announce whenever a door or window was opened. As I reached to flush the toilet, I heard a loud thud from Daniel's room. My first thought was that he must have forgotten something and come back. But the house was silent again. Too silent. A pit formed in my stomach. Something didn't feel right. I crept toward the bathroom door and quietly locked it. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I stood there, listening. Then I heard it. A voice. It was low, almost like a whisper, but too deep to be Daniel's. I could make out the words, just the harsh sound consonants like S and T. My entire body went rigid. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They moved from Daniel's room toward the hallway. Toward me. The footsteps stopped right outside the bathroom door. I held my breath. My legs felt like they were locked in place. I backed away from the door, positioning myself near the small window in case I had to escape. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the footsteps turned away. I heard them move toward the staircase, followed by a loud, crashing noise, like something heavy falling onto the middle platform of the stairs. Then another crash at the bottom. And then silence. My mind raced. Had someone broken in? Had they left? I was about to step toward the door when the security system spoke. Front door opened. Whoever it was had left. My shoulders sagged with relief. But just as I reached for the doorknob, a sharp, violent noise erupted from below. My breath hitched as I turned toward the ground. The laundry chute. Something was slamming against it from the basement. It sounded like someone was jabbing at the small metal door with a broomstick, desperate to break through. I watched, paralyzed, as the tiny door rattled with every hit. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. I don't know how long I stayed frozen in that bathroom. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Eventually, I forced myself to move, creeping toward my room to grab my phone. I called my parents. No answer. I sat on my bed, gripping the doorknob so hard my knuckles turned white, and waited for them to come home. When they finally did, they didn't believe me. Daniel didn't either, until I told him the story years later. That's when he admitted something strange had always happened in that house. that sometimes at night he heard things moving above him. Our attic, which had an old wooden hatch that led into his room, would creak open on its own. I still don't know who or what was in that house with me that night, and honestly, I don't think I ever want to find out. Story 2. My name's Natalie, and I was 17 years old at the time, living with my dad in a rundown apartment complex in Chicago. Life in that part of the city was far from glamorous. Constant sirens, sketchy people hanging around, and the kind of place where you always checked over your shoulder when walking alone. Our apartment was small, old, and had paper-thin walls. But the worst part, our neighbor. We lived on the 6th floor, and right next to us was an older man who always seemed to be sitting outside his door on a rickety folding chair. He was in his 60s, bald with patches of gray hair on the sides, and always had a blank look on his face. Every time I walked by, he would stare, never saying much at first, just watching. My dad told me to ignore him, but something about the way he watched me made my skin crawl. Then, things got worse. One day, as I was coming home from school, he finally spoke. "Hi, Natalie." My stomach dropped. I had never told him my name. I never even spoke to him. I kept walking, pretending not to hear. But from that day on, he made it a habit of greeting me by name every single time I passed. One Friday night, my dad was working late, so I was home alone. As I unlocked the apartment door, the neighbor called out to me. Not a greeting this time, but a question. "Your dad, working late tonight?" I hesitated. Then, in a moment of pure stupidity, I nodded before stepping inside and locking the door. After eating dinner and finishing some homework, I decided to take a shower. The building's plumbing was old, and the pipes made weird noises, but while I was in the shower, I heard something different. A low, guttural noise, like someone grumbling. I froze, heart racing. It sounded close. Too close. Wrapping myself in a towel, I stepped out of the bathroom, listening. The noise had stopped, but something fell off. That's when I noticed it. A tiny hole in the wall. I knelt down, heart pounding, and peered through. An eye. There was an actual eye staring back at me. I fell backward in horror, scrambling away from the wall. My mind raced. That wall separated our apartment from the neighbor's. He had drilled holes to spy on me. Panic surged through me. I ran back to the bathroom and frantically searched the walls. Sure enough, another hole. He had been watching me in the shower. I grabbed my phone and called my dad, my hand shaking. As soon as he picked up, I blurted out everything, but before he could even respond, bang, bang, bang. A loud knocking at the door, followed by a voice. "Open up, Natalie. I need to talk to you." It was him. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall. "Dad, he's at the door," I whispered. My dad told me to call the police immediately. I did, and thankfully, their response time was fast. Within minutes, I heard sirens outside. The knocking stopped, and then shouting erupted in the hall as officers arrived. My dad got home shortly after, furious. He pressed charges for stalking, invasion of privacy, and criminal mischief. The building evicted the man, and the landlord had to patch up the holes at the neighbor's expense. I never saw him again. But even after he was gone, I never felt safe in that apartment again. We moved out a few months later. I still have nightmares sometimes, and to this day, I always check the walls of every place I live in, just in case. Story 3. I'll never forget the time my friend Nate and I went on a backwoods camping trip deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Nate is one of those survivalist types, an expert camper experienced hiker, and someone who genuinely enjoys being lost in the wilderness. He's the kind of guy who believes that real camping means cutting yourself off from civilization, not pulling into some designated campsite with running water and picnic tables. This time, he convinced me and his girlfriend Rachel to come along on one of his more extreme excursions. I wasn't a seasoned camper like Nate, but I was eager to push myself out of my comfort zone and see what all the fuss was about. The trip wasn't exactly planned in advance. I got a last-minute invite when another friend backed out. Rachel had been hesitant about coming, but ultimately decided to tag along. We loaded up Nate's old Jeep with our gear and set off, driving through winding back roads before finally turning onto an unmarked dirt trail that led us deeper into the mountains. We followed that path for miles, until the trees grew so thick that it felt like the outside world had disappeared entirely. Nate finally stopped in what seemed like an arbitrary spot and announced that this was our campsite. No clearing, no trail markers, just dense woods all around us. We unpacked the Jeep, hauling out tents, sleeping bags, food, and other essentials. Nate, being the expert, had taken care of most of the gear, bringing along survival tools, a first aid kit, and even a hatchet. He handed out tasks. I was in charge of setting up the tents. Rachel gathered some supplies, and Nate went off to find firewood. As night started creeping in, the eerie silence of the wilderness settled around us. We built a fire, cooked some food, and cracked open a few beers while swapping old stories. The fire cast long, flickering shadows on the trees, making the forest around us feel even more alive. At some point, Rachel decided to call it a night and retreated to her tent. Nate and I stayed up a while longer, our conversation eventually fading into quiet contemplation. The air was thick with the sounds of nature, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. But then something changed. A new noise, out of place, reached our ears. It wasn't the sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. It was footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching over twigs and dry leaves. Nate hushed me and listened. At first, he brushed it off as a deer or some other wildlife, but I could tell from his body language that he wasn't entirely convinced. The sound was getting closer, and something about the way it moved didn't feel right. I whispered, "What if it's a bear?" Nate shook his head, whispering back that a bear wouldn't be walking around like that near people and fire. Then we heard something even stranger, a low, guttural clicking noise, like a mix between an insect's chirp and a growl. It sent a shiver down my spine. The fire's glow only reached so far, leaving the rest of the woods in complete darkness. Whatever was out there was just beyond our sight, circling us. Then, suddenly, I saw the shadow. A huge, bipedal figure passed between the trees, its silhouette outlined against the dim firelight. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body froze in pure terror. The thing moved closer, its footsteps slow but deliberate, until it was just outside Rachel's tent. Then, the fabric of the tent shifted. Something was pressing against it. Rachel let out a blood-curdling scream, and all hell broke loose. Nate shouted, "Run." I bolted from my chair as Rachel stumbled out of the tent, her face pale with terror. I didn't stop to look. I just ran. The sound of snapping branches and pounding footsteps followed us as we sprinted through the darkness, our lungs burning with every breath. Whatever was chasing us was fast. Too fast. I could hear it right behind me, each footstep shaking the ground beneath me. By some miracle, Nate managed to lead us straight back to the Jeep. We scrambled inside, and he fumbled with the keys as Rachel sobbed beside him. The moment the engine roared to life, he slammed on the gas, sending us flying down the narrow dirt trail. But the road was winding and treacherous, forcing him to slow down. I looked out the back window, and that's when I saw it, standing in the distance, barely illuminated by the red taillights. A massive figure, too tall and too thin to be human, standing motionless in the middle of the road, watching us. Go, go, go. I screamed, and Nate floored it, not stopping until we were back on paved roads, miles away from that place. We never went back. We left everything behind. Tents, supplies, even Nate's expensive hatchet. None of us were willing to risk facing that thing again. To this day, none of us know what we encountered that night. Maybe it was some kind of unknown predator. Maybe it was something not of this world. Whatever it was, I don't ever want to see it again.